Welcome to Lucid Dreams History. These are some stories of the Oregon Trail for you to fall asleep to. Sweet dreams. Catherine Sager Pringle, The Orphans Road. The year was 1844, and the Missouri River glistened under a pale morning sun. Wagons creaked in long, groaning lines, oxen snorted clouds of steam into the cool air, and children's voices mixed with the shouts of men testing harnesses. Somewhere in that sea of hope and dust were the Sagers, a family of 9, Father Henry, Mother Naomi, and their 7 children, including 9-year-old Catherine. The day they left, Catherine later recalled, the wagon's boards were scrubbed clean, the canvas taut, and the barrels inside filled with precious flour, bacon, dried beans, and the few comforts Naomi insisted upon: a Bible, a kettle, a sewing box. It was, Catherine wrote, the beginning of what seemed to us a grand picnic, with all the world for our playground. The first weeks. The trail at first was green and generous. Spring rains had left the prairie dotted with wildflowers, blue and yellow and white, stretching as far as a child's eyes could see. The Sager children tumbled from the wagon whenever the train halted, gathering blossoms and running until their legs ached. At night, the air was scented with wood smoke and the faint sweetness of prairie clover. But the prairie is fickle. By mid-June, the heat lay over the land like a hammer. Flies tormented the oxen until their hides rippled, and dust coated every tongue. Henry Sager, walking beside the wagon to spare the animals, began coughing more often. Still, his voice was strong enough to lead the morning prayers. We had a long road ahead of us, Catherine would recall decades later, but no thought of turning back entered Father's mind. It was Oregon or nothing. The first loss. By late summer, Henry's cough deepened. Somewhere along the Platte River, he could walk no more and rode inside the wagon, the boards beneath him hard and jarring. The family's pace slowed, though Catherine remembered how the other immigrants would circle back to lend help tightening wheel bolts, checking the oxen's yokes. One morning, Catherine awoke to hushed voices. Her father lay still, eyes closed, chest barely rising. Naomi knelt beside him, lips moving soundlessly. Before the sun reached its noon height, Henry was gone. The men of the train dug a grave near the riverbank, the earth dry and reluctant to yield. Naomi placed her hand on the mound and whispered, "Henry, I'll see you in Oregon." Catherine wrote, Father was buried, and his bleaching bones lay where the wind swept over him, with no stone to tell the passerby who slept there. The train moved on that same day, for on the trail, grief had no luxury of pause. Naomi's burden. Now Naomi drove the team herself, her small frame straight in the driver's seat. 6 days a week, she guided the oxen through wind and mud, only stopping on the Sabbath to rest and read scripture aloud. At night, she nursed her baby and soothed the younger children while the older ones gathered firewood or hauled water. Summer tipped into autumn, and with it came the mountains, at first distant blue humps, then sharp teeth against the horizon. Naomi's hands grew calloused, her face drawn. The baby sickened. The dust had been relentless in his lungs. One frosty dawn, his cries stopped. They buried him at the base of a cottonwood. Catherine wrote of her mother's eyes then, like glass, seeing something far away. The second blow. Near the Snake River, in present-day Idaho, cold rain set in for days. The wagon struggled through sucking mud, the oxen's hooves bleeding. Naomi developed a fever. The doctor in the train had little but willow bark and kind words. The fever burned through her in less than a week. On a gray morning, the Sager children stood in a tight knot as the men lowered their mother into the ground. Catherine remembered no weeping from her siblings. We were numb, as though our hearts had frozen. Orphans of the trail. Now 7 children alone. The immigrants debated what to do. Some argued to divide them among families until Oregon. Others said to keep them together. The decision was made. They would all ride in one wagon driven by a neighbor, though the children worked to earn their keep, herding livestock and gathering fuel. In October, after months of dust, mountains, and the endless beat of boots and hooves, the Sagers arrived at the Wyatt mission of Dr. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman near present-day Walla Walla. The Whitmans took them in, offering beds, food, and something like stability. For 3 years, the mission became home. Catherine grew into adolescence, helping with laundry, teaching younger children letters, and recalling the grave mounds scattered along the trail. Echoes of the trail. Even decades later, Catherine's words carried the smell of dust and the ache of loss. We had seen the earth open and close too often. Death was an old acquaintance by the time we reached Oregon. Her memoir stands as one of the most haunting child's eye accounts of the Oregon Trail, a testament not to romance or adventure, but to endurance. Amelia Stewart Knight, Motherhood on Muddy Roads. The spring of 1853 began with the smell of damp earth and thawing fields in Iowa. Wagons were being loaded across the countryside, but in the Knight household, the work was doubled. Amelia Stewart Knight, 38 years old, wife to Dr. Joel Knight, and mother to 7 children, had to prepare not just for the grueling 5-month journey ahead, but for the endless demands of family life that would continue inside a jolting wagon. From the first day, her diary became the heartbeat of her journey. It was a plain little book, bound in worn leather, where she captured not only the road's facts, but the moods of her children, the way the air smelled before rain, the aching worry when one fell ill. Setting out. The morning they left, oxen snorted clouds of steam in the cool air. Amelia stood on the wagon step, calling for the children to climb in. Joel checked the harnesses one last time. They joined a long train of families headed west, the air buzzing with excitement. At first, the road was kind. Meadows rolled out in green waves, and the children leapt out at every stop to gather wildflowers. Amelia wrote, "We have had a pleasant day's travel. The children run beside the wagon, chasing the butterflies." But the ease was short-lived. The rain begins. By the 3rd week, skis turned iron gray. The wind smelled of wet soil and far-off storms. Rain began one night with a whisper, and by morning was drumming on the wagon canvas. Amelia's entry for that day was almost a groan. "Raining all day. The boys are all soaking wet. We are a poor-looking set. Oh, Oregon, you must be a wonderful country." The trail dissolved into thick, sucking mud. Oxen strained against the weight, their hides streaked black with it. The wagon wheels sank half their height, each step forward an effort. At night, wet clothes steamed beside the campfire, and Amelia rocked her youngest in damp skirts. Sickness and strain. The endless damp brought sickness. Amelia's middle son, Edward, woke one morning flushed and coughing. She kept him close in the wagon, dousing him with the little medicine they had. The other children grew restless, but the cramped space was too wet to send them out. She wrote with quiet determination, "The road is hard, the air chill, but we must keep on." A neighbor's child developed the same cough and died within 2 days. The burial was quick, in a grave dug between willow roots beside the road. The train moved on as the parents walked behind, their grief trailing like smoke. Cooking for 9 in the open. Each evening, no matter how weary, Amelia prepared supper over an open fire. Bacon hissed in the pan, beans bubbled, coffee brewed in a blackened pot. Children circled, holding out tin cups. She had a knack for stretching supplies of cornmeal pancakes when flour ran low, broth from the smallest scraps of meat. On cold nights, she gathered them all beneath blankets in the wagon, telling Bible stories or recounting memories of their farm back in Iowa. The creak of wagon boards and the hiss of wind became their lullaby. Crossing the Platte. The Platte River crossing tested everyone. The water was high, a slow brown flood. Wagons were ferried in shifts, the oxen swimming beside. Amelia stood barefoot in the shallows, skirts clinging, coaxing the children across one at a time. On the far bank, Joel drove the team out dripping and shivering. They lost a barrel of flour that day, slipped from its lashings and rolled into the current. Amelia's face tightened, but she said nothing, only began planning how to make the remaining food last. Mountains ahead. Weeks later, the horizon lifted into jagged peaks. The Blue Mountains. The air thinned, grew sharp and scented with pine. Nights turned cold enough that water in the tin cups froze. The descent was the hardest, narrow paths, the wagons chained to keep them from rushing ahead. One wheel splintered on a hidden rock, and Joel worked by lantern light to mend it. Amelia kept the children close, their faces pale in the moonlight. Arrival in Oregon. By the time they reached the Willamette Valley, the air was heavy with the scent of green growing things. Fields lay open, dotted with farms, smoke curling from chimneys. Amelia's last diary entry on the trail read, "We are here at last. Oregon is indeed a wonderful country." It was not relief so much as a deep, quiet exhaustion. She had kept them alive, clothed and fed across 2,000 miles of mud, dust, and mountains, all while mothering 7 children and tending to whoever else needed care. Margaret Frink, The Fever, the Flood, and the Mosquitoes. In the spring of 1850, the Sacramento Valley shimmered in the distance like a promise, but for Margaret Frink and her husband, the journey west was not yet half begun. Their route from the east had already tested them with bad water and bone-rattling roads, yet Margaret's journal brims with a voice that is at once practical and quietly awed by the immensity of the land. By the time they reached the Missouri frontier, their wagon was heavy with barrels of flour, bacon, beans, and the tools her husband swore they would need for building a life in California. Margaret had packed one indulgence, a sewing kit with bright thread, to make a little color in the hard life to come. Into the plains. The first weeks on the plains were deceptively kind. The air was warm, grass waist-high, and wildflowers rippled in the breeze like waves on water. At night, the wagon train gathered for singing. Fiddle music drifted under the stars. Margaret noted in her diary, "The air is sweet, and the moon large and golden. We might almost imagine ourselves in a garden if it were not for the howling of wolves in the distance." But as they pushed west, the garden became a desert. Grass gave way to brittle scrub, the wind grew hot, and the Platte River, once wide and generous, shrank to muddy shallows. The mosquito swarms. One evening, as the sun sank red over the prairie, the air thickened, not with dust, but with mosquitoes. They rose from the marshy edges of the river in black clouds, so dense they blurred the view of the opposite bank. Margaret wrote, "Mosquitoes were as thick as flakes in a snowstorm. They covered the oxen in black masses until the blood was streaming down their sides. We fought them with smoke, with cloth, with our hands, but still they came." The animals stamped and swung their heads miserably. Margaret and the other women tied damp cloths over the children's faces, leaving only their eyes uncovered. That night, few slept. The whining of the insects seeped through canvas and cloth alike. Flood on the trail. Days later, a thunderstorm rolled across the plains, the clouds towering like mountains. Rain fell in sheets, and within hours the dry ground became a lake. The wagons bogged to their hubs, the oxen strained until their flanks quivered. Margaret described the chaos. "The water came so fast it swept the cooking fire from under the kettle and the coffee was lost. Blankets were soaked, food barrels wet through. We stood in water up to our knees, passing goods from one wagon to the other. One wagon tipped sideways, its load spilling, sacks of flour melting into white paste in the floodwater. When the storm finally moved on, the trail was a scar of mud and debris. They moved slowly, shoveling a path in places, repairing wagons in others. Margaret's hands blistered from the work, but she wrote of it with matter-of-fact resignation. The fever. It was after the flood that fever came. At first it was one man shaking, flushed, unable to keep food down. Then another and another. The mosquitoes had done their work, spreading what the immigrants called ague, a malaria-like illness. Margaret nursed the sick with what they had: willow bark tea, cool cloths, rest when the wagon stopped. Her own husband was struck, his skin hot to the touch. She sat beside him in the wagon, fanning away the stifling air, counting the hours between his fevers. One night she wrote, "The train is quieter now, for so many are ill. The laughter of the early days is gone. Only the lowing of oxen and the coughs of the sick remain." Pressing on. As the weeks dragged, the fever loosened its grip. Faces regained their color, laughter returned in cautious bursts, but the trail did not grow gentler. Rations ran low after the flood's ruin, and every meal was stretched. The bread was dense, the coffee thin, the meat stringy. Margaret found joy in small things: a patch of wild currants, a cool breeze from the north, the sudden sight of antelope on the horizon. "It lifted us," she wrote, "as though for a moment the weight of the road was gone." Reaching the mountains. When at last the Rockies appeared, pale blue in the far distance, the train erupted in cheers. The land grew rougher, streams cold and swift, the air rich with pine. It was not the end, far from it, but for Margaret it was a turning point. After so much flat land, the mountains seemed like the very bones of the earth, and we were among them. The fever, the flood, the mosquitoes, all became part of the long, unshakable memory of the road. Louisa Cook, The Hunt in the Buffalo Country. The year was 1862, and the prairie was restless under the summer sun. Louisa Cook, traveling west with her husband and a small train of wagons, had already seen more open land than she'd ever imagined existed. But it was the buffalo country that would etch itself deepest into her memory: the endless grass, the hot wind, the smell of animal and dust that carried for miles. Their wagons rolled along the Platte River's upper reaches, the ground dry and cracked beneath the wheels. On either side, the prairie stretched in shades of gold and dull green, broken only by the occasional rise of buttes in the distance. The air was sharp with the scent of sagebrush, and overhead, hawks circled on invisible currents. Signs of the herd. They knew they were entering buffalo range long before they saw the animals themselves. Hoofprints gouged the earth, sometimes so deep the wagon wheels jolted as they crossed. Trails beaten by generations of bison cut across the land like great, dark scars. Louisa wrote in her journal, "We saw their traces everywhere, broad paths across the hills, dung still warm where they had passed only hours before." The men in the train grew restless with anticipation. Fresh meat was rare on the trail, and the thought of buffalo steaks sizzling over a fire was enough to set every mouth watering. The hunt begins. One dawn, with the horizon washed in pale rose, the scouts spotted them, a herd dark and massive, grazing on a far rise. The men were on their horses in minutes, rifles slung across their backs, faces alight with excitement. Louisa stood by the wagons, the children craning to see the distant, shifting mass. From where she stood, the herd seemed almost to move as a single living thing, rippling across the prairie in slow, powerful waves. Dust hung above them in a golden haze. The riders disappeared toward them, and the waiting began. Hours passed under the blazing sun. The wind stirred only enough to bring the faint smell of the animals, musky, earthy, wild. The return. By late afternoon, the hunters returned. Their clothes were streaked with sweat and dust, their horses lathered and footsore, and yet the triumph was muted. Louisa recorded, "The boys were almost wild with excitement when they set out, but they returned footsore and weary, and with only one small antelope to show for all their trouble. The buffalo had been too far, too quick. The herd had sensed them before they could get close enough for a good shot, vanishing over the hills with a speed that belied their size." Making do. The small antelope was quickly skinned, the meat divided into thin strips. Louisa boiled a portion for supper, the rest set to dry in the sun for jerky. It was not the feast the men had envisioned, but in the scarcity of the trail, even a mouthful of fresh meat was something to savor. That night they ate around a low fire, the flames flickering in the prairie wind. The children gnawed happily at the tender pieces, while the men retold the chase in exaggerated bursts. How the herd had thundered like an earthquake, how the dust had choked the sky. Louisa smiled at the stories, but her mind lingered on the image of that dark, moving tide of life rolling across the horizon. Storm over the plains. The next day brought one of the prairie's sudden transformations. Morning was still and bright. By afternoon, black clouds towered in the west. The air grew heavy, the wind sharp. Louisa hurried to tie down the wagon's canvas while the men corralled the oxen. The storm struck with a roar, wind driving sheets of rain sideways, lightning splitting the sky. The flat land offered no shelter, so they circled the wagons tight, huddling inside. The sound of the rain on canvas was deafening. The thunder rattled the very boards. When it passed, the air was cool and washed clean. The land steamed under the late sun, and the horizon was once again vast and empty. The herd returns. 2 days later, as they moved along a low ridge, Louisa saw them again, buffalo, this time much closer. The herd grazed in a wide basin, the calves sticking close to their mothers. The men spoke of another hunt, but the memory of sore horses and empty rifles tempered their ambition. Instead, they watched. Louisa described the sight in her diary. The ground seemed to tremble under their steps. They are creatures of another age, as though the world before ours still lingers here on the plains. By evening, the herd had drifted eastward, and the wagons pressed on toward the mountains. Abigail Jane Scott, the beauty and terror of the Blue Mountains. The year was 1852, and for Abigail Jane Scott, the journey had already been a tapestry of hardship and wonder, months of jolting wagons, dust in every breath, and skis so wide they seemed to bend toward the earth. But nothing in all the miles behind her prepared her for the final great obstacle before Oregon, the Blue Mountains. From the rolling heat of the plains, their first appearance was like a mirage, faint blue shadows smudging the western horizon. As days passed, they grew clearer, rising like a wall between the immigrants and their new lives. Approaching the wall, Abigail wrote in her journal, "The mountains are adorned with splendid groves of fir trees, dark against the lighter hillsides, and the air grows cooler with each mile." At first the sight lifted hearts. The land was greener, streams clearer, the oppressive heat of the plains behind them. Children ran ahead on the trail, shouting when they found cold water to splash in. But with the beauty came a quiet unease, for every immigrant knew the Blue Mountains had claimed wagons, oxen, and lives. The first climb. The ascent began gently enough, rolling hills dappled with pine and fir, wildflowers nodding in the breeze. The air smelled of resin and earth, so different from the dry grassland behind them. But soon the trail steepened. Wagon wheels groaned against the pull of gravity, iron rims sparking against stones. Men shouted at the oxen, voices sharp with effort. The women walked to spare the animals, skirts catching on low branches. Abigail noted. The road grew narrower, and on either side the forest pressed close, tall trunks rising like pillars into a green vault above. Chains and courage. When the trail pitched sharply downward, the immigrants stopped to chain the rear wheels of each wagon. Without the chains, the wagons could outrun the oxen, crashing into them and breaking legs or backs. Abigail stood by as her father and brothers wrapped the heavy iron links through the spokes. Her mother gathered the smaller children, warning them to keep clear. Then, with a shout, the wagon lurched forward, sliding and jolting down the slope. The sound was a mix of grinding wood, straining harness, and the low rumble of wheels locked against the earth. A narrow escape. Midway down one steep pass, a wagon ahead of them lost control. One chain snapped, and the wagon began to pick up speed, the oxen bawling in panic. It swerved, struck a rock, and tipped, spilling barrels, bedding, and a crate of crockery that shattered against the stones. Miraculously, no one was killed, but the delay cost precious daylight. Repairs were made as shadows thickened under the trees. That night, they camped on a narrow ledge, the forest closing in so tight they could see little of the stars. Abigail wrote, "The air was cold and still. The pines whispered like voices far away. Water and weariness. The next days were a blur of steep climbs, sharp descents, and constant labor. Streams rushed cold and clear, but the ground was littered with roots and slick with moss, making every step treacherous. Oxen stumbled, drivers swore and pulled at the yokes. Abigail's hands blistered from helping push the wagon wheels over obstacles. The forest, beautiful as it was, seemed endless. When at last they reached a high ridge, the view took her breath. Hills rolling away in layers of blue and green, the late sun slanting gold through the trees. It was as though we had climbed into another world, untouched and vast, she wrote. The descent to the valley. The final descent was the most dangerous of all, a long, steep road cut into the mountainside. Below lay the valley, the promise of Oregon at last. The wagons went down one by one, the chains clanking, oxen digging in their hooves. Men walked beside them, bracing the wheels with logs when they could. By the time Abigail's family reached the bottom, dusk had fallen. Camp was made beside a stream, the sound of the water mingling with the lowing of the animals. Abigail's last words about the Blue Mountains were simple but full of feeling. They were the hardest days of the journey and the most beautiful. The blizzard at South Pass, Mary Jane Graves' fight for life. The wind at South Pass did not howl that day, it screamed. Snow came in sideways sheets, slashing the eyes of anyone foolish enough to look up. The wagon canvas groaned like a ship's sail straining against a storm. It was October 1846, and the Graves family, Mary Jane among them, had already crossed half the continent. They had no idea the Sierra Nevada mountains ahead would become their tomb for many of their companions. This was the winter of the Donner Party. Mary Jane Graves was 21 that autumn, her face still softened by California dreams, though her hands were calloused from months of driving oxen, lifting heavy barrels, and steadying her bonnet against prairie gales. Her family had set out from Illinois with hopes of rich farmland in the Sacramento Valley. But the Graves had fallen in with George Donner's company and followed the infamous Hastings Cutoff, a shortcut that cost them weeks. Now trapped in the Rockies' cold grip, Mary Jane wrapped herself in every scrap of cloth she owned. 2 wool skirts, a quilted shawl, and her brother's old coat with the sleeves rolled short. Still, the wind pierced through. "We must move on, Pa," she told her father, Franklin Graves, her voice trembling from more than cold. "Not in this whiteout," he said, staring toward a horizon that no longer existed, only whiteness, swirling and endless. "We pitch here." They pitched camp in the lee of a ridge, driving stakes through snow into frozen earth. Oxen stood miserably, their flanks shuddering. Snow crusted in their lashes. The family huddled in the wagon, the canvas creaking above them, wind finding its way through every seam. The land closes in. For 3 days the storm did not relent. Snow drifted over the wagon wheels, erasing the trail behind them. Food was already running low, the Graves had rationed since the salt desert, when Hastings, shortcut, had stolen precious weeks. Now their flour barrel was half empty, bacon down to a few strips. Franklin Graves knew the truth but did not voice it. If they could not cross the Sierra soon, the mountains would seal shut. On the 4th morning, the wind slowed enough for visibility. The world outside was unrecognizable, the familiar brown sage hills now sculpted into white dunes, ridges like frozen waves. Mary Jane stepped into the snow, her boots sinking to her knees. She looked east and west. The world felt emptied of color. They pressed forward, oxen laboring in the drifts, snow squeaking under the wheels. By sundown, the sky turned steel gray again, and more flakes began to fall. It was as if the land itself had decided they were not meant to pass. "We're not going to make it before winter," her sister Nancy whispered that night. Mary Jane stared at the flickering fire. "Then we'll have to make winter give us back our lives," she replied. The Sierra Wall. Weeks later in November, they reached Truckee Lake, today's Donner Lake, where the first true wall of the Sierra rose before them. Fresh snow, 8 feet deep, lay in the passes. The wagons could go no further. They built cabins from pine logs, roofed with canvas and brush, and prayed for a thaw. The days became a cruel cycle: dig paths to the lake for water, scrape lichen from rocks for the cattle, melt snow for cooking. Hunger hollowed them. The grave's bacon was gone, flour turned into a watery gruel. Mary Jane recorded in her memory each stage of hunger. First, the constant gnawing. Then, a dull weakness. Finally, the mind's strange detachment, where the thought of food was less urgent than the act of moving one's fingers to keep blood flowing. In early December, Franklin Graves made a fateful decision. A party would leave on snowshoes to cross the Sierra and bring back help. Mary Jane, strong-willed and unwilling to see her family waste away, volunteered. The Forlorn Hope. The snowshoe party, 17 men and women, set out on December 16th. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. Each carried a meager bundle of food: dried meat, a biscuit, maybe a strip of rawhide. The snowshoes were crude, bent from green willow and rawhide thongs. They sank knee-deep with every step. By the third day, the meager provisions were gone. "We must turn back," someone muttered. "We turn back, we die," Mary Jane answered flatly. On the 6th day, they lost another Antonio, a teamster, to exhaustion. The next morning, Franklin Graves could no longer rise. He pressed Mary Jane's hand into his eyes hollow. "You'll go on," he told her. "Tell your mother I tried." He died that night in the snow. They covered him with pine boughs. Hunger, now a living creature inside them, forced them to what no one dared name aloud. They took the bodies of the dead, cutting strips of flesh to keep the living moving. Mary Jane never spoke of the taste, only the weight of carrying such knowledge the rest of her life. Breaking through. After 33 days in the mountains, 5 of the original Forlorn Hopes stumbled into Johnson's ranch in California, Mary Jane among them, gaunt as a wraith, her eyes sunken yet burning with life. She had walked across death itself. Rescue parties followed her back into the mountains, bringing out the survivors in waves. But Mary Jane's father, Franklin, and several siblings were gone forever, buried in the Sierra snow. Years later, when she was an old woman in California, someone asked Mary Jane about that winter. She sat quietly for a moment, then said, "The mountains took what they wanted, we gave the rest." Ezra Meeker, The Last Journey Home. In the dawn of the 20th century, the dust of wagons and the crack of oxen whips had long since faded from the Oregon Trail. Railroads, automobiles, and bustling towns had reshaped the West. But for Ezra Meeker, a pioneer who had crossed the trail in 1852 with his young wife and child, the memories burned fresh as ever. Ezra was a man on a mission: to preserve the history of the Oregon Trail before it vanished beneath modern progress. In his 60s, he undertook a remarkable journey retracing the very route he had taken as a young man, this time by covered wagon and mule team, gathering crowds and telling stories of endurance, hope, and loss. Remembering the past. Ezra's original crossing was fraught with hardship: dust storms, river crossings, illness, and loss. His journals recalled nights spent sleeping under endless stars and days of relentless heat. Yet it was the spirit of the pioneers that captivated him most. The trail was a thread of courage running through the heart of a continent. Determined that future generations would know this history, Ezra set out in 1906 to relive the journey, promoting preservation and marking graves, wells, and wagon ruts. The slow journey. Traveling by mule-drawn wagon, Ezra's pace was slow but deliberate. He stopped in towns along the way, sharing lectures and photographs, rallying support for a monument to Oregon Trail pioneers. The landscape had changed: farms where grass once waved, highways cutting through valleys, and cities sprawling where only wilderness had stood. Yet echoes of the trail remained. A forgotten cairn here, a rusted wagon wheel there. Ezra often remarked, "The land speaks if you listen. It tells of those who came before, their footsteps, their struggles, their dreams." Challenges along the way. The journey was not without hardship. Mechanical failures, harsh weather, and skepticism from younger generations tested Ezra's resolve. Once, his wagon wheel broke near the Platte River, and a group of local children helped him mend it with scrap metal and bound twine. But he welcomed these moments, each obstacle a reminder of the pioneer's own trials. Legacy and farewell. By the time Ezra reached Oregon, crowds greeted him: schoolchildren, historians, descendants of immigrants. He spoke at ceremonies dedicating markers and monuments, his voice rich with passion. Let us honor those who dared to dream beyond the horizon, who braved the unknown for a better life. Ezra Meeker's journey helped ignite a movement that preserved the Oregon Trail's history and landscape for future generations. He passed away in 1928, but his spirit rides still on the endless trail of dust and dreams. Narcissa Whitman, the first white woman to cross the Oregon Trail. The air was cold and crisp on that early spring morning in 1836. The sun peeked shyly over the horizon, casting a soft amber glow across the gently rolling hills of Missouri. Narcissa Whitman stood quietly by the wooden wagon, her bonnet tied snug under her chin, and her hands folded before her, steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling inside. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and fresh grass, but it was thick with something else: anticipation, a nervous energy shared by the small band of missionaries and settlers preparing for a journey few women had dared to undertake. Ahead of them stretched a path so wild and unknown that even the most seasoned travelers spoke of it in reverent whispers: the Oregon Trail. Marcus, her husband, paced nearby, checking their provisions and tending to their oxen. His face was weathered but resolute. To him, this was a sacred mission: to bring Christianity to the native peoples of the Pacific Northwest, to plant the seeds of civilization in the vast wilderness. But for Narcissa, the journey was also deeply personal. As the first white woman recorded to cross this trail, she carried not only the hopes of her faith and family, but the weight of expectation and the unknown dangers that lurked in every mile. That morning, before the caravan rolled out, she wrote in her journal by the flickering light of the campfire: "The heavens above are a glorious canopy, infinite and pure. The earth beneath holds secrets beyond imagination. Each step forward is a step deeper into God's design, though the path is fraught with peril." The first days were a delicate balance of hope and hardship. The trail wove through green valleys and rolling plains, dotted with wildflowers and the tracks of unseen animals. The wagons creaked and groaned, laden with Bibles, medical supplies, blankets, and the bare necessities for survival. Dust clouds trailed behind the moving caravan, settling on faces, clothing, and the land itself. Narcissa's hands, though soft and refined, were soon calloused from daily chores: drawing water from cold streams, tending the sick, preparing meals over smoky campfires, and comforting frightened children whose wide eyes mirrored her own fears. One afternoon, as they rested beneath the sparse shade of a cottonwood grove beside a swollen river, she paused and inhaled the scent of sage and wildflowers carried on a gentle breeze. She noted, "The wind carries the scent of sage and wildflowers, yet beneath this beauty lies a land indifferent to our desires. Our journey tests both body and spirit." Dust storms came without warning, swirling like angry spirits and blinding the travelers in a haze of grit. Nights were bitter cold, the howling wind slicing through blankets and bones. Coyotes howled in the distance, a haunting soundtrack to long, lonely vigils. Illness shadowed the caravan like a silent predator. Dysentery, fever, and exhaustion claimed many. Narcissa, though weary, tended to the afflicted with a steady hand and gentle voice. She wrapped blankets around shivering bodies and whispered prayers into the cold night air. One day, a woman in the party went into labor beside the trail. The cries of the newborn mingled with the creaking wagons and the rustling of the tall grass. Narcissa knelt, her fingers steady as she helped usher new life into a world so harsh and uncertain. Months later, after enduring drought and deluge, scorching days and freezing nights, the party reached the lush Walla Walla Valley. Here the Whitmans built their mission, simple log cabins nestled among evergreens and fertile fields. They welcomed native Cayuse children, teaching them to read and pray, planting crops to sustain the growing community. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Epidemics of measles and smallpox ravaged the native population, the invisible scourge brought unwittingly by the settlers. Fear and suspicion deepened. In November 1847, as the cold settled over the valley, the simmering conflict exploded. A group of Cayuse warriors, desperate to protect their people, attacked the mission. Narcissa, Marcus, and others were brutally killed. Their deaths sent shockwaves back east, highlighting the tragic collision of cultures and the profound costs of westward expansion. Yet Narcissa's story endured, a symbol of courage, faith, and the complexities of a new world being forged under endless skies. George Donner, leadership in the Hastings Cutoff. Spring 1846 was a season of hope and promise. George Donner, a respected man of means and family, set out from Springfield, Illinois, leading an immigrant party of nearly 90 souls bound for the fertile lands of California and Oregon. The group, large and diverse, carried dreams of prosperity and new beginnings. Children laughed and played among the wagons, elders offered wisdom and prayers, but the journey ahead was unforgiving. As the party reached the established Oregon Trail, whispers spread of a shortcut. Lansford Hastings, an enterprising guide, had promoted a route through the Great Salt Desert that promised to save weeks of travel, the Hastings Cutoff. Tempted by the prospect of a faster passage, Donner's party made the fateful decision to diverge from the tried and true path. The desert was an expanse of blazing sun and shifting sands, where water was scarce and the land was harsh beyond imagination. Wagons bogged down in alkali flats, oxen dropped from exhaustion, tempers frayed and fear took root. George Donner carried the heavy mantle of leadership. His wife, Elitha, recalled. He bore the burden with steadfast resolve, even as the weight grew heavier with every passing day. Weeks slipped away under the relentless sun and stinging wind. Food grew scarce. Some emigrants splintered off in search of game or better routes. By October, the Sierra Nevada's jagged peaks emerged, dusted with snow. Undeterred, the party pressed on. But winter struck early, trapping them near what is now Donner Lake. The cold was merciless. Icy winds cut through furs and blankets. Snow piled high, sealing their fate. Starvation gnawed at their bones. With no other choice, the trapped souls resorted to consuming the flesh of the dead. The horror was profound, but survival was the only law. James Reed, banished earlier after a violent quarrel, made a desperate and heroic trek to find help, braving snowbound mountains and near-certain death. George Donner himself did not survive the ordeal, succumbing to the elements and hunger alongside his family. Their story became a grim legend, a stark warning of the costs of hubris and the cruelty of nature. Eliza Spalding, first white woman in Idaho. In 1836, young Eliza Spalding journeyed west with her missionary family, venturing into lands no white woman had yet called home. She was to become the first recorded white woman in the area now known as Idaho. The landscape was breathtaking. The Snake River shimmered like molten silver, winding through towering cliffs and dense pine forests. Yet it was also dangerous. Swift river currents threatened to capsize boats. Thick underbrush concealed wild animals. The mountains loomed with unforgiving cold. Eliza's journals speak of wonder and resolve. The river's song is both wild and gentle. The forest whispers ancient stories. Here, among strangers and nature's majesty, I find both challenge and grace. At the mission, she learned the language of the Nez Perce people, taught children to read and write, and helped foster early bridges of trust. But disease and cultural disruption cast long shadows. Many native children fell ill, and Eliza felt the heartbreak deeply. In a letter home, she wrote, "Though we seek to teach, we are also learners. This land and its people are gifts and burdens entwined." Her journey stands as a testament to faith, endurance, and cross-cultural encounter on the frontier. Stephen Meek, the controversial guide. Stephen Meek was a rugged mountain man whose knowledge of the western wilderness was legendary. Yet, his name became entwined with tragedy and controversy. In 1846, he championed a shortcut, the Hastings Cutoff, that promised a faster, easier route west. Many emigrants trusted Meek's expertise and followed his lead. But the desert terrain was brutal. Water vanished in the searing heat. Wagons bogged down in sand and brush. Oxen died of thirst and exhaustion. Countless immigrants suffered, including those who became stranded in the Sierra Nevada during winter. Meek himself expressed conflicted feelings years later. "I sought to show a better way, but the land was crueler than I had imagined. I bear my share of blame, but so too does the wilderness." His story is one of courage shadowed by error, a reflection of the precarious balance between frontier daring and peril. The wagon wheel ruts, the trail's lasting mark. Today, across Wyoming and other western states, the deep wagon wheel ruts etched into the earth remain, scars left by thousands of wagons and the people who drove them. These ruts are carved deep, sometimes over a foot in depth, and stretch for miles across plains and hills. Standing in these ruts, one can almost hear the creak of wagon wheels, the lowing of oxen, and the murmur of pioneer voices carried on the wind. Historian James A. Lowell said of the ruts, "They are the land's memory, a map written in soil and stone. Each groove tells a story of hardship, hope, and a nation's birth." Visitors today walk the ruts with reverence, feeling the tangible connection to the brave souls who carved a path to the west. Native American guides and interactions. The Oregon Trail was never traveled alone. Native American guides played vital roles in helping immigrants navigate vast, unfamiliar terrain. Tribes such as the Shoshone, Nez Perce, and Cayuse offered knowledge of safe passages, water sources, and seasonal changes. Old Toby, a Shoshone guide, famously led wagon trains through treacherous mountain passes. Yet these relationships were complex. The influx of settlers disrupted native lands and lifeways. An emigrant reflected, "They were our guides, our guardians, yet the trail was a wound in their homeland, a fracture between worlds." The story of the Oregon Trail is one of cooperation and conflict, resilience and loss, across cultures. Women's work on the trail, daily life and survival. Behind the scenes of the Great Migration were the women whose strength held families and communities together. They cooked meals over smoky fires, hardtack, salted pork, beans. They washed clothes in icy rivers, mended torn dresses, and soothed sick children. Their days began before dawn and stretched long into night. Letters and diaries reveal their courage and exhaustion. Sarah Raymond wrote, "From dawn till dark, I labor with no rest but the hope of tomorrow. We bear the weight of this journey in our bones and hearts." Their resilience was the silent force that made westward expansion possible. The role of oxen and horses, the lifeblood of the trail. The dawn air was crisp and sharp in early spring. the prairie grass damp with dew and the smell of earth freshly thawed from winter's grip. As the faint blush of sunrise touched the horizon, the great beasts, oxen and horses, stood tethered patiently by the wagons, their breath steaming in the cold morning. Around them, the muffled sounds of camp stirring whispered through the quiet. Oxen were the steady heart of the Oregon Trail. Large, patient, and powerful, these bovine giants were preferred by many immigrants for their resilience and sure-footedness. Unlike horses, which required richer feed and were prone to injury, oxen thrived on rough grasses and could endure days of heavy pulling with slow, unyielding strength. They carried the hopes of families, the weight of household goods, provisions for months, and the fragile dreams of a new life far beyond the mountains. John Wilson, a wagon driver in 1852, captured the essence of the oxen's importance in his journal. Our oxen are the silent engines of this long and dusty trail. Without them, we would be stranded, our dreams buried beneath the earth we seek to claim. Their patient strength humbles me daily. The care of these animals was a constant, exhausting task. From before dawn, men and women alike took turns leading oxen to the nearest streams, ladling cool water into wooden troughs fashioned from old barrels or carved wood. Feed was gathered, wild grass, sagebrush, whatever the land could offer, often scant and tough. Flies and biting insects swarmed mercilessly in summer, biting at their eyes and flanks, making rest a rare luxury. The journey was perilous for both man and beast. As the wagons rumbled over rocky passes and across marshy plains, hooves sometimes slipped, and oxen occasionally faltered under the weight. One morning near the Platte River, a deep concern rippled through the caravan when old Ben, a favored ox belonging to the Miller family, collapsed in exhaustion. The family circled around him, pouring water on his tongue and offering bits of softened grass. His heavy breath slowed, and for a terrifying moment, hope wavered. But with steady care and time, old Ben rose again, earning a chorus of relieved sighs and cheers. His recovery was nothing short of miraculous on a trail where every animal's life was precious. Horses, though swifter, were often more fragile. Used primarily for scouting or riding, they carried messages, led the way, or pulled lighter loads. Their speed was invaluable when traversing the open plains or scouting ahead for water and grazing, but they demanded richer feed and water, luxuries in short supply on the trail. At river crossings, anxiety gripped the immigrants. The roar of rushing water, slick rocks, and cold currents terrified the animals. Wagons were often dismantled to ferry parts across separately, and oxen and horses were coaxed with soothing words, gentle reins, or firm prods. The success of a crossing could mean life or death for a family. In the evenings, tired oxen would rest beneath the stars, lying down in thick dust and exhaustion. Their muscles, sore and beaten by miles of travel, reflected the arduous journey of their masters. And just as the pioneers drew hope from the flickering campfires, so too did the oxen find rest, the bond between beast and man unspoken but deeply felt. Without these beasts, the great migration westward might have never been possible. They were the silent lifeblood of the Oregon Trail, enduring every hardship in patient solidarity with their human companions. The plight of the children on the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail was a place where childhood was compressed into a harsh crucible of survival and resilience. For the thousands of children who embarked on the journey west, the trail was both a landscape of wonder and a gauntlet of fear. Tiny hands gripped wagon rails as toddlers bounced to the rhythm of the rough paths. Older children ran alongside the wagons, their laughter a rare and precious sound piercing the dusty air. Yet the hardships were ceaseless. The relentless sun beat down during the day, dust filled their lungs, and the nights brought piercing cold that crept through blankets and into bones. Mary Johnson, only 10 years old, wrote in a rare letter home to relatives in Iowa, "I miss my garden and my kittens, but I like the wide sky here. The stars are brighter than at home. Sometimes the nights are so cold I shiver till I fall asleep." Families struggled to shield their young ones from the worst dangers, but illness and accident were relentless. Many children were sickened by cholera or dysentery, their small bodies ill-equipped to fight the ravages of disease. Others were lost or separated in the vast, unfamiliar wilderness. On a bitter afternoon near the Green River, a frantic search was underway. Little Samuel, age 5, had wandered from camp, drawn by the sound of rushing water and unfamiliar bird song. The night deepened, and his parents' calls echoed through the encroaching darkness. Hours passed before he was found, trembling and alone, clutching a handful of wildflowers. Despite the harshness, children found moments of joy and discovery. Songs were sung around campfires, stories told in whispering tones. They marveled at wild horses galloping across plains, the flutter of eagle wings above cliffs, and the dazzling constellations overhead. Children bore heavy responsibilities too. They fetched water, gathered firewood, helped tend animals, and cared for younger siblings. Their play was a brief respite, their resilience a quiet miracle. Disease and medicine on the trail. Invisible yet relentless, disease stalked the Oregon Trail with a terrifying efficiency. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, measles, and smallpox decimated families, sowing death with every campfire. Medical knowledge was limited, and frontier doctors worked with scarce tools and dwindling supplies. Remedies ranged from the herbal, willow bark, sage, and plant poultices, to the drastic, including bloodletting and purging. Dr. John Miller, a physician traveling in 1851, recorded in his worn journal, "I fight a losing battle against sickness that strikes swiftly and without mercy. Our remedies are few. Sometimes faith is all that stands between life and death." Cholera was the most feared. It struck suddenly with violent diarrhea and dehydration. Entire wagon trains were sometimes overwhelmed within days. The cramped conditions, dusty camps, and poor sanitation were breeding grounds for illness. Quarantine was nearly impossible. Families huddled together, helpless as children and elders succumbed. Women took on the role of nurses, their hands steady despite heartbreak, their nights filled with watching and praying. The suffering was a grim reality of the trail, the cost of hope and new beginnings measured in lives lost beneath endless skis. Narcissa and Marcus Whitman's missionary work among the Cayuse. Narcissa and Marcus Whitman's journey west was a story of faith entwined with tragedy. In 1836, they arrived in the Walla Walla Valley, intent on establishing a mission to the Cayuse people. They built sturdy log cabins, planted crops, and opened a school to teach native children reading and Christianity. Marcus learned the Cayuse language, striving to build trust and understanding, while Narcissa nurtured the children and tended the sick. At first, relations were hopeful but cautious. The Whitmans were welcomed, their prayers mingling with native songs beneath towering pines and the distant peaks of the Blue Mountains. Yet tragedy struck as epidemics of measles and smallpox swept through the native population, diseases unknowingly brought by settlers. The Cayuse, devastated and suspicious, believed the Whitmans were responsible. Tensions escalated. On a cold November day in 1847, a group of Cayuse warriors attacked the mission. Marcus and Narcissa were killed, along with 12 others. A Cayuse elder later recounted, "They came with prayers and gifts, but the sickness they brought could not be prayed away. Our people suffered, and anger grew like the winter's frost." The Whitman massacre marked a turning point in Oregon's history, a haunting reminder of cultural collision, misunderstanding, and loss. The Great Snake River Crossing, perils and strategies. The Snake River was one of the Oregon Trail's most formidable natural barriers. Wide, swift, and treacherous, its waters could claim the unwary in a heartbeat. Immigrants faced the daunting task of crossing its currents with wagons, animals, and families. Options included fording at shallow points, building rafts or ferries, or disassembling wagons to transport parts separately. In 1844, the Miller family prepared for the crossing with anxious care. John Miller addressed his family. "We must be careful. The river does not forgive mistakes. Every man, woman, and child must heed the commands this day." Wagons were painstakingly dismantled plank by plank, ferried across on handmade rafts constructed of logs lashed tightly. Oxen were driven through icy waters, their footing sure but their breath ragged. Yet not all crossings were safe. Stories spread of wagons capsizing, families losing possessions, or loved ones swept downstream. One young boy clung to a wagon axle, the river's cold fury threatening to pull him under before rescuers reached him. Successfully crossing the Snake River was a milestone, a triumph that brought cheers and tears to the weary pioneers. Life at Fort Laramie, the trail's vital outpost. Fort Laramie, nestled amid Wyoming's vast plains, was a bustling hub and sanctuary on the Oregon Trail. Its rough wooden walls, palisades, and trading posts offered rest and supplies to thousands of immigrants. The fort was alive with activity, traders bartering furs, soldiers patrolling, families tending gardens. The smell of fresh bread mingled with smoke from cooking fires, and the sound of horses' hooves echoed on dirt paths. Traveler Thomas Harper wrote, "At Fort Laramie, the world feels smaller, warmer. Here, strangers share bread and stories beneath open skis. For a moment, the wild feels tamed." Yet the fort was also a place of tension and uneasy peace. Native American tribes like the Lakota and Cheyenne frequented the fort for trade and diplomacy, but also guarded their lands fiercely. The fort symbolized the creeping tide of American expansion and the growing clash between cultures. Women pioneers' personal letters, voices from the trail. The Oregon Trail story is incomplete without the voices of the women who endured its trials. Sarah Bennett, writing in 1847, expressed both fatigue and hope. "Each day blends into the next, dust, sun, sweat. But I hold on to hope for green fields and gentle rivers ahead. Our strength is tested, but our spirits endure." Mary Sims, mother of 5, shared in a letter home. "The children are tired and sick, yet their laughter is my light in these dark times. We cling to each other as we journey through the wilderness." Their letters reveal the intimate details of daily life: cooking, cleaning, nursing, comforting, woven with fear, faith, and fierce love. These women, often unseen in grand histories, were the pillars upon which the dream of the West was built. The hardships of crossing the Rocky Mountains. The Rocky Mountains rose before the wagon train like an immense, frozen wall, gray spires piercing the horizon under a steel-blue sky. Their jagged peaks were dusted with early snow, a stark warning to all who dared pass. For Thomas Walker and his company, the mountains were the ultimate gauntlet in their long westward trek on the Oregon Trail. From the moment the ascent began, the air grew thin and sharp. The ground changed beneath weary boots and trudging oxen hooves, from dusty plains to scree-covered slopes, narrow ledges, and rocky switchbacks that tested the limits of both beast and man. The early mornings were bitterly cold. Frost glazed the wagons, and breath rose in white plumes as travelers hurried to break camp before the sun vanished behind the towering ridges. Women wrapped children in quilts, hands numb with cold, while men hoisted heavy gear, knowing each step was an inch closer to survival. Martha Walker, holding her youngest child close against the chill, scribbled in a worn leather journal. "The mountains stare down upon us, cold and indifferent. The path is rough and treacherous, and the air bites at my lungs like a cruel dog. I pray for strength to carry us through this frozen gate." Wagons creaked under the strain of steep grades. Oxen pulled steadily, their hooves slipping on loose stones, muscles taut beneath thick hides. When the trail became too steep, the men unhitched wheels and used ropes to drag wagons over rocky outcroppings. The danger was palpable. One misstep could send a wagon plunging down cliffs. One morning, the company was caught by a sudden snowstorm. Blinding flakes whipped across faces, slicking rocks with ice. The children huddled together beneath heavy blankets, while scouts scrambled ahead to find shelter. John Simmons, the lead scout, rallied a rescue party when a small family's wagon broke free of its tether and slid dangerously toward a ravine. "Hold fast, the storm is fierce, but so are we. No one shall be left behind," his voice rang through the wind, steady and commanding. Hours later, the family was found, shaken but safe. The storm passed as suddenly as it came, revealing a landscape transformed, blanketed in pristine white, serene yet deadly. As the caravan crested the final summit, the vast expanse of the Oregon Territory unfolded below, a sweeping promise beyond the mountains, wrath. The Rocky Mountains demanded everything: strength, courage, and hope. Those who crossed emerged changed, marked by the wild beauty and harsh lessons of the high places where earth and sky collide. The California Gold Rush and its impact on the Oregon Trail. In early 1848, news traveled like wildfire across the frontier. Gold had been discovered at Sutter's Mill, nestled along the American River in California. The promise of untold riches ignited a fever that spread to the dusty camps along the Oregon Trail. For years, families had traveled westward with dreams of fertile farmland and fresh starts. Suddenly, the trail pulsed with a new urgency. Some wagons turned south, abandoning their Oregon-bound plans for the glittering lure of gold. James Porter, a sturdy farmer from Ohio, wrote to his sister, "The talk among the men is all of gold, panning in rivers, digging in hills. Many plan to turn our course south. The land of gold calls louder than the fertile fields we sought." The increased traffic transformed the trail. What was once a measured procession became a hurried rush. Wagons were lighter, packed with mining tools, picks, pans, shovels, rather than household goods. Supply posts blossomed into bustling hubs selling provisions and mining equipment at inflated prices. At Fort Hall, merchants juggled shipments of flour and nails with sacks of mining powder and pans. But the gold rush was a harsh mistress. For every fortune found, many faced disappointment and hardship. The long trek to the gold fields was grueling, and the mining camps were rife with disease, lawlessness, and danger. The trail itself became crowded and perilous. Overgrazed grazing lands left oxen weak. Water sources grew scarce as hundreds converged on the same routes. Conflicts erupted over claims and resources, sometimes erupting into violence. Yet the gold rush reshaped the West forever. The Oregon Trail's legacy intertwined with this fevered quest, altering the destiny of thousands. Some struck it rich, others lost everything, but all were part of the great westward sweep. The role of Native American women in assisting emigrants. The story of the Oregon Trail is often told through the eyes of pioneers and explorers, but woven quietly beneath those tales are the vital, courageous contributions of Native American women. Their knowledge, strength, and generosity often made the difference between survival and despair for the weary emigrants. In the winding valleys and rugged hills, women of the Shoshone, Nez Perce, and other tribes walked paths worn by centuries of tradition. They knew every spring and edible root, every hidden shelter and safe crossing. One such woman, known only to the travelers as Little Star, was a niece of the famous Sacagawea. Fluent in multiple tribal languages and familiar with the terrain, she became an invaluable guide to a wagon train stranded in the Bitterroot Mountains. Clara Benson, an immigrant from Missouri, recalled in her journal, "Without the guidance and kindness of the native women, we might never have found safe passage. Their wisdom is a light in the wilderness, and their kindness warms even the coldest night." These women balanced fierce loyalty to their communities with a willingness to aid strangers. They often negotiated peace between hostile groups, translated languages to prevent deadly misunderstandings, and shared knowledge of plants and medicines that soothed sickness. In campfires, flickering light, women exchanged stories, native and immigrant weaving fragile bonds of trust. Many immigrant women credited native women with teaching them how to prepare unfamiliar foods or treat wounds when no doctor was near. Despite the challenges of cultural tension and suspicion, Native American women's role as healers, guides, and peacemakers remains a hidden but essential chapter in the story of the Oregon Trail. The experiences of African American pioneers on the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail was not solely the path of white settlers. It was also a route taken by African American pioneers seeking freedom, opportunity, and new lives far from the shackles of slavery and discrimination. Among these brave travelers were freedmen and women, whose courage and determination added vital threads to the tapestry of westward expansion. One notable figure was James Beckwourth, a mountain man and scout of African and European descent, whose knowledge of the frontier helped guide many wagon trains safely through dangerous territory. In 1852, the Walker family, formerly enslaved people from Missouri, joined a wagon train bound for Oregon. Mary Walker's diary recounts both the universal hardships of the trail and the added challenges they faced. Our journey is filled with the same dust and danger as any, but with added shadows of eyes watching us with mistrust. Yet, hope drives us forward like a fire we dare not let die. African American pioneers often encountered discrimination from fellow immigrants and settlers, yet they persevered, building farms and communities that thrived despite adversity. The Walker family's story is emblematic of the quiet resilience and profound contribution of Black pioneers, pioneers whose struggles for equality intertwined with the very shaping of the American West. The significance of the wagon train's social structure and leadership. The Oregon Trail was more than just a path through wilderness. It was a mobile society, a fragile community forged under immense pressure. The wagon train was a microcosm of order and cooperation, where leadership, trust, and social bonds were essential to survival. Each wagon train developed its own structure. At the head was often a captain or leader, someone with experience, calm nerves, and a strong sense of justice. Scouts would travel ahead, searching for safe routes and water sources, while cooks and caretakers tended the camp. William Harris, a captain remembered by many, was known for his steady hand. Our captain held the group with firm but fair hands. When tempers flared over water or grazing rights, his calm voice reminded us all that we shared one goal: survival. Decisions were often made collectively in wagon councils, especially when choosing routes or responding to crises. These meetings could be tense. Conflicting interests, clashing personalities, and cultural differences threatened unity. Yet the need for cooperation outweighed disputes. Social events, from communal meals to evening singing, knit the group together. Church services offered solace, and storytelling eased the weariness of endless travel. Conflict did arise. Some pioneers chafed under rules, others clung desperately to order. Punishments for theft or insubordination could be harsh, but the preservation of peace was vital. This delicate social fabric, woven from mutual dependence and shared hardship, was the unseen backbone of the Oregon Trail, binding strangers into a traveling community against the vast unknown. Thank you for listening to Lucid Dreams History. Good night.